So our topic today is motor system physiology. And in this topic, I'll be talking about reflexes. So we all know what a reflex is. A reflex is an involuntary response to any stimuli that the body receives, which brings about an action in response to that stimulus. So the reflex is composed of two parts, a sensory part and a motor part. The sensory part carries a stimuli. It does this with the help of what are known as receptors. The receptors sense the stimuli, and these stimuli are carried by the sensory afferent nerves, or the input is carried out by the sensory afferent nerves and carried to the center. The center could be the brain or the spinal cord, where the processing occurs. And the process information is carried by the motor efferents, efferents to the effectors, which bring about the response. The effectors are part of the motor system. The effectors could be skeletal muscles, smooth muscle, or even glands. And this entire arc is what we call a reflex arc. So what are the five components of the reflex arc? We have the receptor, the sensory afferents, the nerves, the center, the motor efferents, again nerves, and then the effectors, which carry out the response, the reflex arc. So I'll be talking about the stretch reflex, which is the simplest reflex in our body. Simplest reflex. And the best example for stretch reflex is the knee jerk reflex. Knee jerk reflex. Let's look at this knee jerk reflex. So first we have a stimulus. So what is a stimulus? We are giving the stimulus with the help of a knee hammer. A knee hammer will strike the tendon of the muscle. We are striking the muscle, which causes stretch of the muscle. The stretch is the stimulus. And this stimulus is detected by the receptor. The receptor is the muscle itself. The receptor, a part of the muscle, in fact, known as the muscle spindle. We'll be talking about that later. So the receptor senses the stimulus, and the sensory afferents carry it to the center. Sensory afferents, sensory nerves carry it to the center, which is the spinal cord in this case. The spinal cord does all the processing, and the processed information is carried out by the efferent nerves and taken back to the muscle again. The muscle again is the effector, which carries out the response. The response is muscle contraction. The muscle contracts and the leg moves as a result of the contraction. So this is the reflex arc in the case of the knee jerk reflex. I'll be writing out the components. The first component is the stimulus, of course, which is stretch. The stretch stimulates the receptor. The receptor here is a part of the muscle which we call the muscle spindle. The muscle spindle is the receptor. The muscle spindle, the information is carried by the sensory afferents to the center, which is the spinal cord. And then we have the motor efferents. And finally, the effector muscle fibers, which bring about the response of muscle contraction. What is the response here? In the end, muscle contracts, and this brings about the characteristic leg movement in the knee jerk reflex. So let's look at this receptor. What is the receptor? It is the muscle spindle. Very important. Muscle spindle. So as I said before, the information is sensed by the muscle and the action is carried out by the muscle. And these are carried out by two separate parts of the muscle. So if we look at the muscle here, we see two different colored fibers. We have the internal fibers called the intrafusal fibers or the muscle spindle. This acts as the sensory part. And then we have the external fibers, the extrafusal fibers, which undergo contraction and comprise the motor part of the reflex. So when the muscle is stretched, the sensory part, the muscle spindle detects it, and the information is carried by the afferent nerves to the spinal cord. The spinal cord sends out the information, the processed information, with the help of the motor nerves. Here in the case is alpha motor neurons, to this external part, the extrafusal fibers, which undergo contraction and brings about response. So that is the muscle spindle. The muscle spindle. Let's look at this muscle spindle in detail now. So it is not a simple single structure, the muscle spindle. There are different types of muscle spindles. Broadly, they can be classified as nuclear bag fibers and nuclear chain fibers. This right here is a nuclear bag fiber. It consists of a central bulged out portion containing numerous muscle nuclei. Whereas the nuclear chain fiber does not have a central bulged out portion, but it consists of the nuclei arranged in a chain. So these are the two types, nuclear bag fibers and nuclear chain fibers. Let's look at the sensory innervation now, the sensory afferents. So we learned of different types of sensory afferents. We know of 1A fibers, 1B fibers, 2, 3 and 4 fibers. Now in this case, it is innervated by 1A and 2. 1A. This green over here is the 1A fibers, and it carries stimuli from both nuclear chain fibers and both NCF and NBF. Whereas if we look at the 2 fibers, 2 and 1A over here, 2 fibers, it carries information only from the nuclear chain fibers. This is important. Now we have particular names for these 2 fibers, and it is according to the shape. If we look at 1A, the shape is like a spiral. So we call these as annulospiral endings. And if we look at the 2 fibers, it has a flower spray shape. So we call them flower spray endings. So these 2 are the sensory afferents which carry the information to the spinal cord. And the spinal cord in turn, by the alpha motor neurons, bring it to the extrafusal fiber. It will be around these 2 fibers. The extrafusal fibers which bring about the contraction of the muscle, as I said before. So this is the knee jerk reflex in a nutshell. To complete our discussion on stretch reflex, we have to talk about one more topic called the alpha gamma coactivation. So let's sum up our stretch reflex real quick. First, there occurs a stretch over here. First, there occurs a stretch. I'll draw it with red, which stretches the entire muscle, activates our muscle spindle, which causes firing of the 1A2 fibers up to the spinal cord. Alpha motor neurons are activated, and finally the muscle undergoes contraction. The muscle undergoes contraction and shortens. So this is our pathway. First we have the stretch, sensory afferents, center gets activated, center processes, alpha motor neurons fire, and muscle contracts. So when the muscle contracts, it contracts as a whole. Both the extrafusal fibers and the interfusal fibers will contract. So this will result in a loss of the stretch. The center has to be stretched for the whole reflex to occur. So when there is a loss of stretch, the reflex cannot go on. So what does this mean? There has to be an additional mechanism to ensure that there is a sustained stretch occurring. Here is where the gamma motor neuron comes in. Just like the alpha motor neurons, the center also fires gamma motor neurons. The gamma motor neurons act on the muscle spindle, but in the peripheries. It causes contraction. So this is a muscle. It causes contraction of the peripheries of the muscle spindle, which cause again a stretch of the muscle spindle. And when the muscle spindle is stretched, the reflex goes on. 1A, 2A gets 1A and 2 get activated. Spinal cord gets activated. Alpha motor neurons get activated, and EFF is stimulated to contract, and muscle contraction occurs unhindered. So this is where gamma motor neurons come in, and this process is called alpha gamma coactivation. Both alpha motor neurons as part of the reflex arc as well as gamma motor neurons from the center firing, they act together to ensure that the stretch reflex goes on smoothly without stopping.